August 12, 2025, midnight over the Baltic Sea. Without warning, 3 Russian submarines broke the surface, and within seconds, a dozen Kalibr missiles tore across the waves. Their target? A $13 billion American supercarrier, loaded with 5,000 sailors and the pride of NATO's fleet. Each warhead could reduce the ship to molten steel in under 2 minutes, but the Russians had made a mistake. High above, E-2 Hawkeye radar planes caught the launch. Below, Aegis interceptors armed and locked. What followed wasn't just an exchange of fire. It was a battle that would decide if the world tipped into full-scale war. Did the supercarrier survive? Or did Russia rewrite naval history in a single night? 12:03 hours. NATO radars lit up with a flash from the east. Space-based infrared sensors, orbiting hundreds of miles above, picked up the hot bloom of a rocket launch. In Colorado, in Ramstein, and deep inside NATO command posts, the alert spread in seconds. Something had lifted off from Russian territory. It wasn't a drill. It was the kind of plume that only comes from a missile accelerating past 7,000 miles per hour. Over Poland's coast, an E-3A AWACS aircraft spun its radar dome, staring east. Operators tracked a MiG-31K streaking high over Belarus, its profile familiar, its behavior not. The jet had gone into a steep dash, then pitched. That wasn't routine air patrol, that was a Kinjal launch. 2, in fact. The Kinjals arced into the sky, then bent downward, angling for sea-skimming flight. Each missile carried the promise of Mach 10, nearly 7,600 miles per hour, fast enough to cross 150 miles of sea in little more than a minute. The design was simple: give the defender as little time as possible to react. But speed alone wasn't enough. Not here, not against a NATO network. From orbit, SBRs relayed warning. From Poland, AWACS confirmed vectors, and on the gray deck of an American destroyer standing picket north of Kaliningrad's defensive bubble, alarms screamed. Missile inbound, multiple tracks, general quarters. In the Combat Information Center, sailors strapped into their stations, eyes locked on glowing consoles. The SPY radar shifted from broad surveillance to fire control, its digital beams carving through sea clutter. Within seconds, the blips solidified. Weapons quality tracks. The tactical action officer snapped the order. Doctrine gates flipped green. Weapons free. In that moment, the destroyer became more than a ship. It became a shield. 90 vertical launch cells stood ready, layered with SM-6 interceptors, ESSMs for leakers, and CIWS for last-ditch defense. Every sailor knew the sequence by heart, because they had drilled it 100 times, but never with a real hypersonic inbound. On shore, civilians in Gdansk heard sirens. Some looked up and saw faint contrails clawing the sky. Unaware, they marked the world's deadliest race, missile versus missile, measured in seconds. It sounded like thunder rolling in from the east, one fisherman said later, recalling the sound over the water. Back at sea, the destroyer's crew watched numbers tick down. 90 seconds, then 80, then less. The Kinjals were plunging, flattening their trajectory to skim the wave tops, hoping to hide behind the radar horizon. But they had already been seen, and that was their mistake. A different launch painted the radar next, this time from a Russian frigate lurking closer to Kaliningrad. 2 Zircons. One climbed, conserving energy at altitude. The other dove early, skimming lower, trying to vanish in sea return. On screens, their speeds read Mach 8, over 6,100 miles per hour. But the tactics carried flaws. The high-flying Zircon gave AWACS a clear, extended track. The low flyer, bleeding energy in thick air, lost precious range. Both were fast, but both were now visible. And Aegis didn't need perfect clarity, it just needed enough. Inside the CIC, timers glowed. 2 inbound, bearing 090, range 200 miles, time to impact, 75 seconds. The voice was steady, rehearsed, no panic, just the rhythm of trained sailors moving through doctrine. Launch commands snapped across the ship. Vertical launch cells clanged. White smoke rose off the deck as the first pair of SM-6s roared skyward. Each missile carried its own radar seeker, each capable of finding a target traveling 5 times faster than a bullet. And this was only the opening move, because in layered defense, the first salvo is never the last. Other NATO ships, tied into the same cooperative engagement network, armed their cells. Engage on remote meant one destroyer could shoot with another's radar data. It meant the Russians weren't facing one ship, they were facing the network. Civilians along the Polish coast saw flashes on the horizon. Some thought they were lightning, others knew better. It was too fast, too sharp, a villager said, watching smoke trails arc upward and vanish into the clouds. On the destroyer's deck, sailors braced as the CIC countdown hit the 30s. SM-6 interceptors were already climbing. guided by uplinks, closing the gap at blistering speed. At these velocities, the geometry looked impossible. But that was the math of intercept. The defender didn't need to outrun the missile. It just needed to cross its path at the right second. Would the hypersonics tear through at sea level, or would America's shield prove once again that unstoppable was just another word for propaganda? And deep inside the Baltic, the geometry of survival came down to seconds, angles, and discipline. 12:05 hours. 2 red tracks cut across the CIC screens. Missile 1 was already climbing high near Mach 9, over 6,800 miles per hour. At that speed, every mile closed in less than a second. From 135 miles out, the destroyer's crew had just over a minute to solve the problem. Missile 2 played a different game. It dropped low early, trying to hug the sea. To the untrained eye, it looked clever, but physics punished it. In thick air, a hypersonic body bleeds energy fast. What looked like stealth came at the cost of speed, and at those speeds, slowing even a little could be fatal. The CIC moved like a machine. Target 1, high track. Target 2, low sea skimmer. The tactical action officer's voice never rose. Doctrine gates flipped green. The first intercept basket opened. Vertical launch hatches slammed. 2 SM-6 Dual-2 interceptors blasted upward, their boosters hammering the deck, leaving long white scars in the sky. Each weighed nearly 3,300 pounds and carried its own radar seeker. Each was designed for this exact nightmare, catching a missile that moved like a meteor but hunted like a predator. On radar plots, geometry lines crossed. The destroyer wasn't chasing the hypersonic. No one could. Instead, it was cutting across the missile's future path, timing the intercept to the millisecond. Missile 1, cruising high to conserve energy, had shown itself too early. That mistake gave Aegis a weapons-quality track before it dropped into play. The intercept was pure choreography. Mid-course guidance updates streamed from SPY radar uplinks, nudging the SM-6s closer. At 30 seconds, the missiles coasted. At 10, their seekers lit, snapping onto the target's infrared glow. At 5, they corrected again, tiny fins biting air. And then, contact. One SM-6 struck nose-on, shredding Missile 1's inlet. The other detonated nearby, throwing high-density fragments into its body. At Mach 9, even a small rupture turned fatal. The Kinjal disintegrated in a cascade of sparks, fragments raining over 20 miles of open water. The CIC stayed quiet. No cheering, just confirmation. Vampire 1 splashed. The countdown rolled on. Missile 2 was still inbound. This one was trickier. Low, noisy, hidden in sea return. The destroyer's SPY radar fought clutter, peeling its track out of the background, but the network already had it. AWACS had been watching since boost. Another U.S. Burke, 40 miles away, took the cue. Cooperative engagement capability meant one ship could fire on another's data. The second shooter lit 2 more SM-6s into the night. Civilians along Poland's coast saw the streaks rise, thinking they were lightning over the horizon. It wasn't thunder, one man said later. It was sharper, like the sky was cracking. Missile 2 tried to jink, pulling hard turns just above the waves. But hypersonics pay for every maneuver. Its scramjet gulped dense air, bleeding thrust. By the time it reached 60 miles out, its speed had fallen under Mach 7. Still fast, still deadly, but no longer untouchable. The first SM-6 missed close, detonating just off the bow shock. The second corrected in its final seconds, slamming into the Zircon's body with a force equal to 10 tons of TNT. The warhead never had a chance to arm. The sea lit up with fire. Fragments showered across the surface, smoking debris punching waves. Fishermen off Bornholm said later they saw the flash from 20 miles away. Like the sun fell into the water, one recalled. Inside the CIC, the watchstanders didn't flinch. Reports rolled in. Vampire 2 splashed. The tactical action officer scanned the screens. No other launches. For now, the air was clear, but discipline held. Sensors searched again. Electronic warfare stations stayed primed. Close-in weapons whirred on standby, because everyone knew. Russia rarely fires just once. The cost ledger was brutal. 4 SM-6 interceptors gone, each worth over $4 million. In 10 minutes, the destroyer had spent nearly $20 million, but Moscow had lost far more. Hypersonic missiles built in tiny numbers, each meant to terrify, had been burned in seconds. Billions in research and prestige vanished in 2 plumes of smoke. And worse for the Kremlin, the myth of invincibility cracked again. Just as Patriot batteries over Kyiv had shot down Kinjals in 2023, the U.S. Navy had now proven at sea that hypersonics were not gods of war. They were just missiles that could be killed. On land, NATO's coastal defense networks buzzed with relief. Air raid sirens wound down. Families stepped out of basements. Children pointed at the fading contrails. The threat had come close, but the shield had held. On board the destroyer, sailors moved through checklists. Damage control confirmed no hits. Combat systems logged expenditure. Command relayed the outcome up the chain. No celebration, just discipline. For the crew, the battle was not won by the intercept. It was won by restraint, by the calm that turned seconds into survival. Still, the questions lingered. If If 2 missiles failed this spectacularly, what about 20? Could magazines hold? Could budgets endure? Could doctrine adapt to saturation? Those answers would not come tonight. But one truth was already clear. Russia's hypersonics weren't unstoppable. They could be broken, if spotted, tracked, and engaged by a disciplined network with seconds to spare. And the world had just seen it, live, undeniable, on the open sea. Yet, as fragments sank into the Baltic and the screens dimmed, a new thought pressed into every commander's mind. If Moscow lost 2 hypersonics in minutes, what would it try next to prove it still held the upper hand? For the sailors aboard the destroyer, that question came only after the silence. The CIC screen still glowed with fading contrails, but the verdict was clear. Both missiles were gone. Missile 1, cut apart high in the sky. Missile 2, shredded low over the sea. The wreckage splashed down 20 miles apart, proof that the billion-dollar gamble had ended in flames. On board, the call was simple. Vampire down. No cheers, no shouting, just discipline. The XO moved through the passageways, checking stations. Corpsmen made sure no sailor had been hurt by launch shock. Combat systems rebalanced doctrine, counting how many interceptors remained for whatever came next. That restraint told its own story. The U.S. Navy didn't need to boast. It only needed to show it could swat down what Russia had sold as unstoppable, and that fact alone sent shockwaves far beyond the Baltic. In Washington, official language was careful. The Missile Defense Agency issued a single line: successful engagement, systems performed as designed. Nothing flashy, nothing political, just confirmation that Aegis and SM-6 had worked as advertised. For allies, it was enough. For Moscow, it was a humiliation. The Russian Ministry of Defense pushed a different tale. State TV claimed the missiles had self-destructed before reaching their targets. Others called the intercept Western fantasy. It was the same denial seen after Patriot batteries downed Kinzhals over Kiev in 2023. But silence on Russian channels told the truth. If the weapons were truly unstoppable, why were they gone? The math only deepened the sting. 4 SM-6 interceptors cost around $18 million. A painful bill for any navy, but small compared to the years and billions Moscow poured into building hypersonics in tiny numbers. In one afternoon, Russia lost weapons meant to rewrite modern warfare, while the US Navy lost only VLS space and spare cash. The myth cracked wider. For years, Russian leaders promised their invincible missiles could punch through NATO defenses at will. Now, images of glowing wreckage told the opposite story. Hypersonics weren't gods of war. They were just missiles. Fast, dangerous, but mortal. Allies took note. NATO commanders pointed to the engagement as proof that layered defense works. Satellites cueing AWACS, AWACS cueing Aegis, Aegis firing SM-6, and other ships ready to step in. Integration, not brute force, had made the difference. A network beat speed, and on the destroyer itself, sailors finally exhaled. The adrenaline faded, but no one forgot the cost of seconds. A single hesitation could have let one missile slip through. A single mistake could have turned victory into disaster. The lesson was as sharp as it was simple. Discipline, not bravado, was what kept the ship afloat. Still, questions hung in the cold air. Could the system hold against 4 missiles? Or 6? What if Moscow threw a full salvo, testing every layer until the magazines ran dry? For tonight, the answer was victory. But in every wardroom and every command post, the thought lingered. If Russia's hypersonics weren't invincible, what escalation would Moscow reach for next? That question didn't just echo in Washington. It rattled every war room from Brussels to Tokyo. For Moscow, the loss was more than hardware. It was a crack in a myth built since 2018, when Putin declared his invincible arsenal of Kinzhals, Zircons, and Avangard's. 2 missiles destroyed in minutes meant the aura was gone. Hypersonics were still fast, still lethal, but no longer untouchable. The strategic message was blunt. A well-networked U.S. Aegis destroyer tied into satellites, AWACS, and allied radars had shredded what Russia branded unstoppable. It wasn't just a military blow. It was political defeat in front of the very audience Moscow most wanted to impress, its own people in the watching world. Allies took heart. In Tokyo, Canberra, and Seoul, defense planners pointed to the intercept as proof that investments in Aegis ashore, SM-6 stockpiles, and E-7 AWACS weren't luxuries. They were survival. Germany doubled down on its Sky Shield initiative. Australia pressed forward with more SM-6 purchases after its own test firings. NATO briefings framed the event as the clearest evidence yet. Integrated air and missile defense works when every link in the chain holds. Doctrine shifted too. The intercept validated the U.S. Navy's mantra of layered defense. Space sensors cue early, AWACS bridges the horizon gap, Aegis builds the track, SM-6 kills in the terminal phase. Behind it loomed the future glide phase interceptor, designed to catch hypersonic gliders even earlier. For defense thinkers, the message was discipline plus depth, not speed alone, wins the fight. But victory carried a warning. Each SM-6 round cost $4 to $5 million, and doctrine demanded 2 shots per threat. 4 interceptors burned in seconds meant nearly $20 million gone. Against 2 missiles, it was acceptable. Against 10, the economics turned brutal. The Red Sea already taught that intercepting wave after wave of cheap drones and missiles can empty magazines fast. Hypersonics magnified the stakes. Expensive to stop, catastrophic if ignored. Russia's credibility suffered most. Every time a Patriot or an Aegis punched one of its hypersonics out of the sky, the invincible narrative slipped further. Russian media tried to spin, talking of decoys or planned self-destructs. But analysts and even ordinary Russians could see the truth. Speed alone wasn't saving them. The very weapons meant to intimidate were now exposing Moscow's weakness. Globally, the ripples spread. China, watching closely, accelerated hypersonic testing. The US pushed harder on space-based tracking satellites. Japan, South Korea, and Australia poured billions into SM-6 and kill chain networking. The arms race didn't stop with the intercept, it sped up. And still, the human layer lingered. Civilians on the Baltic coast heard the sirens, saw contrails vanish into fire, and posted shaky videos of glowing fragments falling into the sea. Sailors aboard the destroyer remembered staring at countdown clocks that ticked down not in minutes, but in seconds. Trusting automation, trusting training, that was survival. The bottom line was clear. Hypersonics trade stealth for speed, and that speed creates heat, shock, and signatures that modern networks can exploit. When those networks are disciplined, layered, and American-led, the missiles can be killed in seconds, not because the interceptors fly faster, but because the defenders think faster. Russia's hypersonics were built to terrify, yet in seconds they fell to discipline, sensors, and steel nerves. The intercept proved that myths shatter when tested, and that true power lies not in speed, but in preparation. For Moscow, the loss was more than missiles. It was the collapse of a story. For America and its allies, it was proof that resolve can hold the line. The next chapter will be harsher still. Be ready. Stay with us, subscribe.